Cat, A Tale of Feminine Redemption by Marie-Louise von Franz. Chapter 4, The Cat in Mythology. Now we should consider the cat and its amplifications both mythologically and materially. One of the most striking things about the cat as a symbol is its ambivalence. Like the serpent, its image oscillates between beneficence and malevolence. Historically, the cat was first endowed with archetypal power at the time when in Egypt it came to be regarded as a sacred animal. Its sanctification meant that it was virtually purified of the dark aspects of its nature and was connected with man's spiritual life. In Egypt, from very early on, the cat was considered to be sacred to Isis, but it was as the daughter of Isis and her husband Osiris that the great cat goddess Bastet emerged in the 22nd dynasty and took precedence over all other goddesses. She was known as the Lady of Bubastis, and her temple stood at the center of the city, surrounded by water. Although conceived as a female, Bastet was often identified with her father Ra. Here, Osiris, Ra, and Horus very often merge, as the gods do in Egypt. In her identification with Ra, god of life, the sun god was believed to engage every night in a struggle of cosmic proportions with Apophis, the serpent of darkness. Thus the snake cat takes its place among the solar heroes of all mythology, who fight with the devil in various forms. The cat was also worshipped as lunar. It was believed that during the hour of darkness, when the rays of sun were invisible to humans, they were reflected in the phosphorescent eyes of the cat, as the light of the sun is reflected in the moon. So here we find the kind of feminine consciousness about which we have spoken already. During the late period in Egypt, Bastet was identified with Artemis, the huntress, virgin goddess of nature, linked with fertility and the feminine presiding over childbirth. According to one myth, when the Greek gods fled to Egypt pursued by Typhon, Artemis transformed herself into a cat, and in this form took refuge in the moon, and Hecate also turned herself into a cat. Together with Freya, the Teutonic fertility goddess married the sun, whose carriage was drawn by two cats. Hecate also represents the evil side of the feminine, the witch, the terrible mother, responsible for madness and obsession. Finally, in the Middle Ages, the cat came to be predominantly endowed with the power of the devil. Some women, it was said, had the power to put their souls into black cats. These were witches, dedicated not any more to the light powers, but to the dark powers, to the devil. The Catholic dissociation from the instincts, sexuality, and, generally speaking, from the feminine natural element probably has much to do with this development of the cat as a destructive, instinctual, feminine symbol. In fact, the black cat may be seen as the shadow side of the Virgin Mary, a projected unconscious desire for revenge against the Church. So we see, very schematically, how the polarity of the cat archetype was established. Now, briefly, let us look at some characteristics associated with both the light and the dark aspects of the cat. The cat is closely linked with consciousness and all creative processes. The sexual orgies of Bastet were believed to increase vegetable, animal, and human fertility. On the other hand, the black cat's orgies, practiced on moonless nights, were virtually sterility rites. Intercourse with the devil, who often took the form of a cat, bore no fruit, produced hail, rain and storms, destruction of crops, death of animals, and sterility or impotence in humans. The white cat was a healer and a nurse. She destroyed poison, counteracted irritation, and strengthened people's powers of recuperation. Her tail was widely used to cure blindness, and, generally speaking, the cat's power appeared to be located in the tail, which is also believed to be an organ of balance. On the other hand, the black witch cat poisoned people's minds, infected their bodies with disease, and inflicted them with blindness. The devil used the tail of his incarnation to bewitch people and bind them to his will. In folklore and fairy tales, the white cat is a liberator of the oppressed, a helper of impoverished or underprivileged young men. It uses its cunning and resourcefulness to overthrow the powers of darkness and brings wealth, power, and honor. The black cat is often an omen of misfortune, bringing poverty and frustration. It oppresses and tortures. It is a traitor and a thief. The solar cat, the light of the world, is to be seen at the foot of Christ, while the demonic cat sits on the foot of Judas. On the positive side, the cat is associated, like the serpent, with immortality. It curls up in a circle and is said to possess 9 lives. On the negative side, it suggests the vicious circle. Because of its unblinking eyes, and due to the fact that it sees in the dark, the cat is also a seer. It possesses foresight and insight. On the negative side, the cat's eyes suggest the power of fascination. They can paralyze their victims. Because of its independence and freedom, the cat has been linked to the virgin, but also, as we have seen, to the witch. The cat is a healer and a servant to men. It protects their houses and crops from rodents and snakes, and has also been seen as a curser, a bewitcher, and a vampire. We now have to consider another aspect of the cat which places it between the extreme polarities which have been seen so far, the cat as medium. According to Gnostic belief, there was a cat in the Garden of Eden, guarding the tree of life with its knowledge of good and evil. In the same way, the Egyptian solar cat was associated with the Persea tree, which was also a tree of life and consciousness. There's also a Celtic legend that tells how an oracular shrine located in a certain cave was found occupied by a slender cat reclining on a silver couch. The cat was thus seen as a medium. It formed a bridge between good and evil, with knowledge of both. It acted as a mediator between them as well as between interior and exterior life, God and supernatural forces, and man. Because it has access to and is at home in both spheres, it has much prophetic wisdom to impart and can teach us how to hold conflicting values in balance. As a symbol of consciousness, it is a psychic entity that knows the way, provided we learn to trust it, honoring, obeying, and following wherever it leads. And to end up, a brief remark about cat sacrifice. The meaning of cat sacrifice appears to have been the destruction of human projections onto the animal, whether they were of dark or light psychic experience. Cat sacrifice was a necessary compensation for great unconsciousness. It constituted an act of recovery from any form of archetypal possession. Thus we find rites of cat sacrifice in Roman Catholic France, as well as in England and elsewhere. And we also find the white cat at the foot of the cross, where, as a symbol of light, healing, and salvation, it represented Christ himself, and like him had to be sacrificed in order to be reborn. In connection with the sun, the cat is a tomcat. Also the cat that helps the hero in fairy tales, as in Puss in Boots, is a male cat and has, if we want to circumscribe it, mercurial qualities. In such fairy tales, he is the knower of the way, the soul guide. He is associated with the sun, and like Mercurius, is always helping with the sun, which is rather different from the she-cat. The she-cat is on the line of the moon, Bastet, fertility, and so on. Cats originate in Egypt. All cats are ultimately of Egyptian descent. There were no cats before. In Egypt, it was a sacred animal, and seems still to be considered beneficent. There's an amusing autobiographical novel by Agatha Christie, whose second husband was an archaeologist who took her to the excavations in Egypt. They lived in a small hut, and the plague of mice and rats was so terrible that they seriously thought of leaving. They put down poison and tried everything, but they couldn't get rid of him. Finally, they complained to the Arab sheik, who said, "Well, that's very simple." The next evening he arrived with an enormous cat and said, "That will settle it." The whole night they heard thumps and squeaks, and within 3 days there were no more mice. Agatha Christie was absolutely overwhelmed by what the cat has really done for man, and that makes us understand the sacred animal. She is a real protector and helper, in the dark and at night when one feels helpless. So for our connections, I would rather stress the place of the female cat, the moon quality, the protectress. Bastet, in Egypt, has no witch traits at all. Her dark side has to do with the land of the dead and of the moon, which is also the land of the dead. But she has no devilish qualities. She is an extremely positive archetypal figure. She has to do with fertility, with folk festivals, and also with music. The sistrum, musical instrument of Isis, was also associated with the cat, and excavations in Egypt have discovered many cats with a sistrum. That is because of those beautiful love songs they sing in the night, though they're not quite for our ears. Bastet was also supposed to be very musical. For instance, at her festival, the people went on barges down the Nile, and the women turned their backs, lifted their skirts, and showed their behinds to the applauding masses on the shore. That was the kind of fun they had in honor of Bastet. Fertility, sexual rights, and even lasciviousness, and so on were part of it, but all on the positive side. She had no dark witch traits. In Germanic mythology, as mentioned, the cat is associated with the goddess Freya, who was an extremely positive goddess. The whole devilish aspect of the cat, its wish aspect, has only come into the foreground since the time of Christianity. That has to do with the patriarchal banishing of the feminine shadow. Then you have the cat as a witch's animal, a devil's animal, or a vampire. There were rituals of evil cat hanging, similar to witch persecutions. One thought naturally they had the means of getting rid of evil, but first one projected evil onto the cat and then hung it. Also, cats are exceedingly tough. They survive the most amazing accidents, very often unharmed. They can fall from high places and always land on their feet. They are very vital animals. I grew up with both cats and dogs. With a dog, we were often at the vets, but with a cat, never. We always survived the most terrible things. Something else one should mention about the cat is its independence. The dog has become a touching, sentimental friend of humans and very loyal. Most dogs, if you drive them out in the wild, will perish or at least become very, very unhappy and miserable, while a cat can more easily resume a wild life away from humans. The cat has never associated with man as closely as the dog has. I was always amused in my youth how the cat was a flatterer. For instance, when it asked for food or when it wanted to be stroked, it just came and rubbed itself this way and that with its tail up. And sometimes if I didn't have time, I said, "Go away, I have to read." Then the cat said, "Okay," and began to rub itself against the chair as if to say, "If you don't stroke me, I stroke myself. It's okay too." A dog would be hurt in his deepest heart and look at you reproachfully. You couldn't do such a thing to a dog, but a cat? Oh, never mind. It never gives its soul into our hands. It's friendly and makes use of us, but remains independent. You often see cat dreams in women who have no independence, who are too doggishly attached to their husband and children, and then I always stress what a cat does. A cat goes its own way. It knows what it wants and goes its own way. A cat comes from certain feeding times, and then it's really friendly. But when it wants to leave, meow. You have to let it. It's very cruel to imprison a cat. You can keep a dog in a flat, but to keep a cat inside a flat and never let out is really cruel because it needs the independence. It needs to roam about and have its own life. This can be a nuisance if they run wild and overbreed. Then there are plagues of cats. They become destructive because there are too many. So this negative side of the cat goes very much with the witch persecution. We therefore have to ask ourselves, what has the Virgin Mary to do with the witch persecutions? Jung has explained that in psychological types, before the rise and spread of the cult of the Virgin Mary, there was the phenomenon of courtly love, the so-called love courts. In the love courts, men began to develop a relationship to women and women to men. That was the start of individual love relationships with the other sex. As you know, the knight chose a lady and did all his great deeds for her. This chosen lady was probably generally an anima type of woman. We know some of these famous ladies. And naturally, this courtly love wasn't always platonic. So in those high aristocratic circles, a lot of illegitimate children were born. They were the children of Count so-and-so, Princess so-and-so, and that naturally created a lot of difficulties. So the church then decreed, as a conscious policy, that the men should not choose an individual lady for their love, but they should dedicate their arms and their heroic deeds to the Virgin Mary. That was propagated, and altogether the church fought courtly love because things began to slip out of its hands, and at the moment of the abolishing of courtly love and the rise of the cult of the Virgin Mary to replace it, the witch hunts began. Jung says that because in courtly love the anima of man and the individuality of woman were recognized. It was an individual thing. It was this knight and this lady. He could learn something about his anima since the lady was of his own choice, and the woman could also develop her individuality. So by replacing individual choice with a collective archetypal symbol, the Virgin Mary, the personal element was lost. Only the collective feminine image was preserved. That was still better than Protestantism, where there is not even a collective feminine image, but it was a suppression of feminine individuality. Then the witch persecutions began. And if you read accounts of these trials, you see that generally women who had a certain originality were accused of being witches. Some were poor, crazy creatures. The last witches in Switzerland, for instance, were obviously schizoid, funny old women who always muttered to themselves and were a bit off the beaten track, and thus caught the projection as witches. But in former times, beautiful women were also persecuted, or women who were otherwise very attractive to men. Naturally, the jealousy of other women and the fears of the men were mobilized, and such a woman was then persecuted. So women who had a certain outstanding individuality, who were a bit different from the average, generally carried the witch projection and then were destroyed. Over time, the persecution of witches became coupled with persecuting the individual element in women, and persecuting also the fact that the man could realize the individual quality of his anima, not only as an archetypal schema, such as he could realize through the Virgin Mary, that led to the persecutions, and with it went, historically, absolutely simultaneously, the vilification of the cat, calling it a witch animal, destructive, a bringer of bad luck, and so on. The projection fell especially onto the black cat, which is still felt to bring bad luck when it crosses one's path. Thus the cat has also very much to do with the independent individuality of the feminine. So now we see that the cat is a shadow of the Virgin Mary. It is that part of feminine nature that the Virgin Mary did not represent, but which would belong to a complete image of the feminine. Therefore, you could say that the Virgin Mary herself has a cat shadow, and in our story, in eating the apples, the Empress penetrates into the mystery of good and evil within the feminine. The tension is not so much the tension between good and evil, but between the impersonal, collective sublime, and what is personal, individual, vital, and natural. It's another polarity which is typical of the feminine realm, and Mary therefore curses the unborn girl and says she has to become a cat. In fairy tales, the established powers, God, the Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and very much also the devil in hell, always acts against children. That means they want to block future development. And that inertia is typical. Established God images, established religious archetypal systems and images are labeled to prevent further development, and that's why the curse of the Virgin Mary does not fall on the Empress. She could have cursed the Empress for having stolen the apple, but instead of that she curses her child. That means she does not want a new form of femininity to develop, and so the girl becomes a cat, which is just the new form of femininity. Along with the curse, the Virgin decrees that the child will be bewitched with all her servants and not take part in human life until a prince comes and cuts off her head and her tail. We will come back to the tail later on when the lady's tail is cut off. I think that is very interesting, that the tail has the real power, so to speak. It is naturally not very individual, for instance. The fox's tail and the wolf's tail are also considered powerful magic. The tail of many animals is a source of magic power. Now, in spite of the curse, our cat girl is not unhappy. She is not forced into a miserable life. She has all her servants in a palace in the woods. She has life, but she is banished from her human shape, cut off from human contact, dehumanized. She's banished into nature, and that we can now understand more fully. It is typical of what happened in the 12th and 13th centuries. The individual feminine element was banished from the official forms of human life and went underground. So the Empress comes home, and the Emperor is delighted to find her pregnant. She gives birth to such a beautiful girl, and everybody is glad. You could look in the sun without being blinded, but when you looked at the girl, you were blinded by her beauty. She grows up quite normally, but when she is 17 years old, suddenly, sitting with her father at the midday meal, she turns into a cat and disappears with all her servants. There are many parallels in fairy tales. Some years ago I studied a Greek fairy tale where a princess was similarly cursed, so that when she was 16 she would be carried away into the desert. That happens, and then all her suffering begins, and finally, her redemption. But before that age, things were alright. That would be the age at the time when one began to make marriage plans for a girl. Then at that moment, she turns into a cat. If she has an independent Eros personality, then at that moment, when she should marry, the conflict becomes visible. And if she is meant to be a cat, that would mean she is meant to be an individual woman, a personality in her own right. An emperor's daughter naturally had no chance to marry according to her own choice. It was a family arrangement in those high up circles at the time. So she finds herself in a conflict and therefore she disappears. She cannot be pressed into the marriage scheme of her parents because she is meant to have something to do with the individuation process of the feminine, which cannot be forced into those conventional patterns. Naturally, it also has to do with the problem of sex. And in a way, by turning into a cat, it means nothing other than she would be if we imagine her now as a real human being, an unsophisticated, naturally individual, a naturally feminine girl who grows up in a conventional environment and is generally liked until the love problem arises. Then she realizes that love is something individual. Love is a question of one's personal fate, for good or ill. One can also make bad decisions, but love is a personal fate. It is not a collective arrangement, and then comes the conflict. So the princess is represented as a symbolic feminine figure, one who, like her cat, follows or is forced to follow her own individual inclination, and therefore disappears from the human realm. As we see, she then lives in a palace in the midst of the forest. She disappears into the unconscious. The forest is especially associated with the bodily unconscious. According to Jung in the spirit Mercurius, it has to do with the psychosomatic realm of the psyche. In fairy tales, one has to be careful because if somebody disappears into the sea, they disappear into the collective unconscious. If they disappear into the sky, they also disappear into the unconscious. If they drown in a river, again, they disappear in the unconscious. So we have to take it specifically and say, what aspect of the unconscious does she disappear into? Now, the forest in general has to do with vegetation. As Jung points out in that essay on Mercurius, vegetation is that life which springs immediately from inorganic matter and feeds on it. It's the first form of life, and therefore it generally symbolizes the vegetative realms of the psyche, where it melts with the material processes of the body, what we now call psychosomatic, where we can no longer say something is purely psychic, nor can we say it is purely physical. There is an in-between realm, which is still very little explored. You sink into your body and only vegetate. If she were a real human being, but she isn't. She's an archetype. She would sink into a kind of inaccessible, depressed apathy. But as she is an archetype, it means that the archetype disappears into a vegetative state, goes underground, sinks into the body of people, or nearly body, and lives there, unredeemed.